We got to address the suburban women problem because it's real.
Suburban women helped determine the 2020 election, but there's more to us than the headlines would have you believe.
The suburbs aren't a homogenous sea of white people in perfect houses. Real change is happening in the suburbs, and we have things to say.
When women share their personal stories, walls come down and barriers are broken.
Welcome to the Suburban Women Problem, a podcast from Red, Wine, and Blue.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. I'm Rachel Vindman.
I'm Amanda Weinstein.
And I'm Katie Paris, filling in for the irreplaceable Jasmine Clark.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. And Katie, thank you for joining us too. We're looking forward to talking with you today. So just a few days ago, one of our favorite guests and supporters on this podcast, Connie Schultz, wrote an article about Christianity in America. She said that her faith is a source of challenge and comfort, but she finds herself having to defend it more and more these days. It's a subject that hits close to home for a lot of us, so we wanted to take this moment to explore our experiences with Christianity, especially evangelical Christianity. What are the overlaps between faith and politics? How has the church shaped our lives and perspectives? Later, we're joined by Hannah Dasgupta, a mom who was raised very conservative in the church. Hannah says her politics have changed, but her faith hasn't. And after that, I get to talk with Kristin Dumais about her book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So, all three of us grew up in the church, and it shaped our childhoods in very profound ways. But Amanda, could you start off and tell us a little bit about your experience with the evangelical church?
Yeah, so first I want to say I read Connie's article. Always a great article written by Connie.
Absolutely.
And I really felt everything she said. And I think it's because there's a lot of pain and people have intermixed religion and politics and used religion and, even their patriotism to do hurtful things. And when I think about how I grew up in the church, so I did grow up in the church. We went to church every Sunday, no exceptions. Well, we made exceptions for camping. But other than that, no exceptions. So I did daily devotionals, all of it. My family was very much in the values of the church. And I think it was where my sense of service comes from. It's why I volunteered in my community as a teenager. It's part of why I wanted to serve my country in the Air Force. To me, faith was simultaneously about my personal relationship with God, and it was a verb, not a noun. It meant doing something. It meant being out there in the community. But in terms of values, it also meant my family and I were very conservative. We voted Republican because one of the most strongly held values that came from that faith was being pro-life. And we saw that issue as the most pressing political issue. And that's why we voted conservative every time we had the option to vote.
Amanda, I have so much admiration for women, for all people like you who grew up one way and found another path. Changing your mind is hard work and it takes a lot of courage. And I just have so much respect for people who did grow up one way, particularly when it comes to the church and religion and faith, which can be so all-encompassing and can be presented as so black and white and right and wrong, to have that realization along the way of, wait a minute, there's a disconnect here. Like everything I'm learning about my faith, which should be a verb, as you beautifully put it, I'm not seeing that happening everywhere. So I'm going to challenge that and find a different way. For me, I don't actually think of it so much as growing up in the church. I think of it as growing up in faith for me. And that's despite someone who my dad was a pastor for many, many years, actually. But he went to seminary before I was born and then ended up going into the family business for years and then going back to being a pastor when I was a teenager. So I wasn't so much raised as the PK, as they call it, the preacher's kids, as my much younger brothers were. But I very much grew up in faith. What was unique about my upbringing is that both my mom and dad came from conservative families. And they were very much, I would say, the ones in their families, at least from my perspective, who were talking about faith most of all. And the place that their faith led them was a radical belief in hospitality and welcoming. And I was raised to believe truly that I could not seek justice hard enough. I could not love people who were different than me enough. I could not want to change systems and power structures that did not favor those with the least in our community enough. And Rachel, so you grew up in Oklahoma, though. I mean, was it more like me? Was it more like Amanda? Because I feel like we grew up sort of learning very different values.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in Oklahoma, so same experience as you. Everyone went to church on Sunday. It was just what you did. And that was pretty much our family. It was expected. All the community's activities, like there were not ever sports on Wednesday night because that was the night that people went to church. And so everything was centered around this. So it was not just a faith thing, it was a culture thing. And a huge part of who I am today is from that background that I have, from the church and from my faith.
Were there connections politically with that? Did it lead you toward, or was it disconnected?
So that's interesting because my dad was more conservative based on his view of the scripture, and my mom was always a Democrat based on her view of the scripture. So they took the same material and arrived at a different place. Later in their lives, they worked at a school. It was a charter school that has a mostly Hispanic population, immigrants from Mexico, and they experienced a world they had never seen before. And so for them, they just saw service and serving in a whole different way, and something that they had never seen, even not so far away from our home where they both grew up. So I remember at my dad's funeral, there was a young man who stood up to talk, and he talked about how he had been in a gang, and my dad, he wanted to leave a gang. So my dad helped him get in touch with a plastic surgeon who removed his gang tattoos. And then at his home, he didn't have access to running water, so they got infected. So every day my parents would go in extremely early. My dad would dress his wounds and care for him. And that is the Jesus that I was taught about. But unfortunately, I don't think that's the view of Jesus we get today. And that makes me really sad.
Yeah, there has been so much in my mind, just the cooptation, the hijacking for political purposes of, what Christian faith is, which makes me really sad, actually, because I feel like for me, it's just been such a motivator throughout my life to build bridges to other people, to accept and love, and even when it's hard. And it upsets me that Christianity is used and abused in ways that are so far and foreign to me. But I also recognize, and I think I have to recognize, the pain that it has caused so many. And it's understandable why so many people have a discomfort with, who I might really share values with, but they have a different, their journey is different than mine in terms of how we came to that shared value space.
Yeah. It reminds me, did you see the movie Saved? I think it was Mandy Moore was the main character. And there's a scene where she's holding a Bible and she chucks this Bible at her friend, hitting her friend with a Bible. And she's yelling at her, "I am filled with God's love." And this scene I remember stuck in my brain that at the time, I think that actually really made me see yeah, I see that, right? You might not literally be chucking your Bible at someone's back, but that's kind of how it's used. You are hitting people with this religion, hurting them, at the same time yelling, "I'm filled with God's love."
Weaponizing it. Yeah.
When we're a child, we understand as children. Then when we go older, we understand on a deeper level. So I think in reading Kristin's book, who I talk to later, it's one of my favorite books. I'm always talking about it on Twitter. You can see people, the ideas change, and they can change in many different ways about their faith throughout a lifetime. We need to give ourselves grace to change as more information, as we learn more information, as we have more life experiences. I don't think now about life, about people the same way I did when I was 27, now that I'm 47. And this is something that I learned mostly from my husband, actually, because I used to be a pretty judgmental person. Just his experience as coming to this country as an immigrant He's just had a completely different view of things. But I think we need to open ourselves up to have those friends. In my case, it's a spouse, but to have those close relationships with people, and we can take their experiences and kind of internalize them, to examine them and see where they fit in. And I think that just comes with age and experience.
Rachel, you mentioned Alex, who is Jewish. My husband is Jewish. Amanda's husband is Jewish.
I know. We have like a club thing going on. Yeah.
All three of us are married to Jewish men. Like, Rachel, do you consider yourself a Christian today?
I do. We are members of a synagogue, a loving synagogue who has loved us through everything we've been through. And we are active members. It's an important part of our lives. Our daughter is raised there Jewish, but she also is familiar with my faith, and we also celebrate Christian holidays as well. What about you, Amanda?
I consider myself a Christian, and Rachel, it's interesting hearing about your experience with Alex, because I feel meeting my husband, who's Jewish, also opened my eyes to seeing some of the things that I thought as an evangelical Christian that I thought were true were not. And one of them, I had this view of people just need to hear about Jesus. They just don't know, and I need to tell them about Jesus. And then when he knew some of the prayers and hymns as well as I did, being a Jewish man, I was really surprised. Like, wait, but you haven't heard about him, right? And he's like, no, I've heard about Jesus a lot. And it was just
word is out.
Everybody in this country knows, right? And so that was actually like kind of surprising, knowing how much he knew about Jesus, when I was kind of told like, oh, people just don't know and I just need to tell them. And that was a very different view. And that changed my view as an evangelical Christian. But also, our relationship actually started off in the church. Our very first date was in a huge mega church in Colorado Springs.
God bless him.
And
wow.
Now I know how much you really liked me. But our first dates were actually in churches, because that was so much who I was. And he was comfortable enough to then tell me some of the things they said that were hurtful that I didn't even think were hurtful. When you had the pulpit call, right? Calling people to the pulpit to find Jesus because otherwise they would go to hell. I actually didn't see that as hurtful at all. I saw that as kind of revelatory and isn't this nice? And he said, that's really hurtful to me. And I saw it after he explained it. I saw those things that we were doing that were hurtful. And when we were finding a church later on, I said I wouldn't find a church that did that. Because I saw how hurtful it was, and I wouldn't want to bring hurt into our life. One of my favorite verses actually said when we had the rabbi say this verse when we got married was, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. It's not even faith, right? Faith is actually not the greatest thing. So if our churches, if our religion, if our community, our faith community isn't espousing love, then we're not getting it right.
100%. All right, let's talk to another mom who's changed her mind on politics, but she hasn't lost her gift of faith. Hannah lives in the suburb of Westerville, Ohio. Hannah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, could you start off by telling us a little bit about your upbringing in the church?
Sure, absolutely. I was raised in Central Ohio with my parents and my three brothers. My parents were in what we call the full-time ministry. So in essence, anytime the church doors were open, we were there. During those early sort of coming of age years, I started to realize, first of all, that maybe I was a little different, and that maybe the trajectory that was set out by the evangelical church was not the one that I was going to follow. And what I mean by that is the environment that we were in was very family focused, and people were getting married young. We really embraced those traditional roles of the husband being the breadwinner and the wife staying home with the kids. And so when you're 18, 19, 20, and you're certainly not having sex, and you think you found this person that you want to be with, why wait? Right? So lots of people were in the late teens and early 20s were just kind of on the hunt for their partner. And for some, that's wonderful, and that worked for them, and how lovely. But I think I recognized that maybe I was a little different when I was 19 and I had an opportunity to go to Latin America for an internship, and I was going to be gone for a year. And our pastor was very supportive, and he was kind of sending me off one Sunday, and I remember walking past a young mom who was just a couple years older than me, but already had 2 children. And she looks at me with this scoff and says, "Don't you ever want to get married?" And it was just so apparent to me in that moment that my mindset was a little bit different than those of my peers.
Oh, yeah, I felt similarly where I felt different from my church members, even though I fully felt the same values that they did. But some of the expectations I didn't feel.
Exactly right. Yeah, I remember another story along similar lines that happened even a couple years prior to that, where I was working at a job that I loved at a radio station, of course, a Christian radio station. And I loved that job. I felt so alive, and it was not a big deal to work 40 plus hours and come home feeling energized. But I can recall driving home one night and realizing that I had fallen in love, and it was not with the man that was going to make me a mother and provide for us and build this family. I'd fallen in love with a career, and I felt so conflicted. I remember running home and waking up my mom, which tells you how young I was and how ingrained this mindset is, and saying, Mom, how am I going to do both? I don't have the bandwidth to love a career and love a person. I'm not dating anybody right now, and feeling so conflicted, like how could I ever have both? And I think that was just one of the moments where I realized that maybe there's more, and maybe I need to have some other influences in my life to kind of navigate my own path.
So Hannah, this could have led, and I think maybe it's been the path for a lot of women who they sort of have a realization, a sense of disconnect from the faith I was brought up in, and now I'm having different ideas. And so they turn their backs on that faith. But you are, a woman of some of the strongest faith, of the women I know. And at the same time, you will hear, you will hear Hannah saying like, look, it's not like we're going to defer to our husbands here, ladies, like she's very clear on her values. So what was that, like a decision point or a feeling? How did that evolve for you?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if there was a specific moment of clarity. I think it was little rocks all along the stream that I just kept jumping on. And I think I've never been comfortable being controlled. And I'm a big, but why kind of a person. And so I may go along with the flow a little bit, but eventually I'm going to kind of take a step back and reflect and say, well, why are we doing this? And if for any reason my heart doesn't connect with it, I'm not going to go the other way, but I am definitely going to hit the pause button, and I'm going to sit there for a little bit and try to figure out why am I doing this, and is it sustainable? So that's a long way of saying that whenever there would be a conflict of, well, this didn't feel right, or this, I felt like this was a little demeaning, or I'm valuable too, as far as like deferring to your husband. I think I just found a partner where we wanted to be on the same page and we wanted to be equal contributors. And I actually have embraced those very traditional roles. I've been a stay-at-home mom for the last 10 years, and I have loved every second of it. I kind of grieve the fact that it's starting to come to an end with I've started to work part-time, but that was never, I was never banished to the house. My husband and I knew that this is how we wanted to structure our family long before, and he couldn't do what he does without me, and I couldn't do what I do without him. And so it's just that partnership that's been so valuable, and it's something that we try to take into every aspect of our life, and especially with our faith. Faith is something that you can't see, but it's definitely something that I can feel. And it's just taking those baby steps and really checking in with your heart to make sure you're going the right way that has kept us going on a good path.
That's beautiful. I love it. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story with us. After this is my interview with Kristin Dumais about her book, Jesus and John Wayne. I've been talking about her book on Twitter ever since I read it, and I was just so excited to chat with her. That interview is coming up after the break.
Are you tired of right-wing attacks on education? Head over to redwine.blue and use our action tool to write to your local officials in support of an accurate and honest education about race. With just a few clicks, you can send a letter to both your state representative and your senator. And while you're there, why not sign up for Red, Wine, and Blue's weekly newsletter, The Cul-de-sac? It has ways to get involved, an advice column for those sticky political situations, and more. Visit redwine.blue to join the party today.
Our guest today is the New York Times bestselling author of Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. I loved this book. It hit really close to home. I've been talking about it all the time on Twitter since I read it, and it's my pleasure to have Kristin Dumais here. Welcome to the Suburban Women Problem.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start out. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about Jesus and John Wayne and why you decided to write this book about white masculinity in the evangelical church?
Sure. The idea for the book actually came to me more than 15 years ago. I was a new professor at a Christian university at Calvin University, and I was teaching a course in U.S. history, and I wanted to show my students how gender worked in history, especially masculinity. In Christian circles, it's often seen as, God ordained and what does the Bible say? But I wanted to show them how ideas of gender change over time. They're linked to economic shifts and to race and to foreign policy. And so I planned a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt. I showed them how Roosevelt's masculinity was linked to American empire, American power, and to white supremacy. And after that class, a couple of guys came up to me and said, Professor Dumais, there is this book that you have to read. And that book was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And in the early 2000s, that book was everywhere in evangelicalism. It went on to sell more than 4 million copies. I opened the book up. We first went to my family Christian bookstore, bought a copy, opened it up, and sure enough, there's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt right up front. And Eldredge goes on to sketch this very militant, militaristic conception of Christian manhood. Interestingly, he wasn't really drawing on the scriptures all that much. He was drawing on Hollywood heroes, especially Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. And his God was a warrior God, and every man had a battle to fight. So that was very interesting to me. It was also the early years of the Iraq War. And I was seeing all the survey data showing how white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support that war, support preemptive war in general, condone the use of torture. And I just asked, what might one of these things have to do with the other? I explored that for about a year, set it aside. Other things happened. I had 3 kids, wrote another book. And then in the fall of 2016, I picked that research up again and really used it to understand and explain evangelical support for Donald Trump.
Well, you did an amazing job. It's clearly very well researched. And I think that's, one of the things I appreciated about it. It wasn't you pontificating on your thoughts on masculinity. You really lay it out, the shift. And it shows in your book that it is really well done. I don't think anyone can argue with that, even if they, disagree with your conclusions. Among evangelicals, Trump won by an even larger margin in 2020 than in 2016. What do you think that says about, in particular, evangelical values in America?
Yeah, in 2016, there was a lot of shock at evangelical support for Trump, both inside and outside evangelical circles. And a lot of people were asking, how could white evangelicals betray their values to support somebody like Donald Trump? But because of this research that I had done, this research into white evangelical visions of masculinity, of this militant, aggressive Christian manhood, I knew that was the wrong question to be asking, that this was not a betrayal of evangelical values. We just didn't really understand what those values were. And if we recognize that an aggressive white patriarchal authority is really at the heart of evangelical family values, then a lot of things start to fall into place. And this is not a betrayal of evangelical values. This is in many ways consistent with some of those core values. And so, I think that I saw that already in 2016, and I think that has very much been confirmed over the last 4 years, because that's a really long time to be holding your nose to vote for somebody. It's a long time to be living in conflict with your core values. And so I think that that's not really what was at play.
Your book also examines not just the role of gender in the evangelical movement, but also race. And you discuss the backlash against the civil rights movement. What connections do you see, between that and the current evangelical backlash against critical race theory?
Yeah. Yeah, I set out to write a book about gender, and very quickly I realized it was also a book about race, because these ideals of Christian manhood were racially specific. I noticed early on that the heroes that evangelicals were drawn to, and they love their heroes, the heroes they were drawn to were invariably white men, and often white men who proved their aggressive, heroic masculinity by subduing non-white populations. That's where John Wayne comes in. He popped up over and over again. And if you think of, what he symbolizes, who he was on screen, in so many of his films, he was the cowboy hero subduing Native Americans. He was, fighting at the Alamo against the Mexicans, or Sands of Iwo Jima against the Japanese, or the Green Berets against the Vietnamese. And this is really, really consistent with a lot of their heroes, right? It's the white man with a gun who is the hero, who is the good guy, and the threats are non-white populations. And so this is really baked into this ideal of Christian masculinity in evangelical circles, even though it's rarely explicit. And so they can embrace this idea that they are colorblind, that they don't see color, that they are absolutely not racist, and they really believe that. And yet many of their core values are deeply shaped by their white racial identity. So similarities to CRT, yes, it's been really remarkable for me as a historian to watch CRT emerge, to watch the anti-CRT movement emerge. I mean, just 2 or 3 years ago, I actually had to Google it, and I do critical theory, but that's not my field, right? Legal theory, and so I do cultural history. You don't need CRT to do good history and to really reach the exact same conclusions that CRT will bring you to. And so it's been fascinating to see how white evangelicals really jumped on this anti-CRT wagon and helped create this movement, and alongside other Republicans, and it makes a lot of sense. If every man has a battle to fight, and that's what it is to be a Christian man, then you need enemies. You always need enemies, and you've got to find those enemies. And so whether it's communism or feminism or secular humanism or radical Islam, or now it's Democrats or CRT, you need that enemy to fight, and that's really how this script works. And you can see it historically, but it's another thing entirely to see it in real time.
I just have to ask, did writing this book cause you to struggle with your faith? And if so, how did you deal with that? How do you separate the idea of the church from your faith? Because I don't think we separate it very well in the United States.
Yeah, so I am a Christian. I teach at a Christian university, and I attend a church just down the road here. And, writing this book did not make me struggle with my faith, in part because for a long time, I've held to a very different conception of Christianity. And so, my understanding of Jesus is not this kind of warrior Christ who slays his enemies. And so to follow Christ is to fight the battles ruthlessly. My idea of Jesus that I came to embrace has been one of, somebody who divests himself of power. And that's what's so radical about the gospel. And that's what's so difficult about being a follower of Christ, because it is countercultural. It goes against our nature. But that's the faith that has always inspired me. And so honestly, to write this book was cathartic. It was really helpful for me to be able to put down in words what I'd been observing, what I'd been seeing, because that's what was really troubling for me, to be in the thick of it, to watch this play out, to see family and friends in my church communities really be drawn into, what I call a corruption of the faith. I'd lived that for a couple of decades. And so to be able to name it very precisely and hold it up for all to see really felt empowering.
Yeah. A friend of mine recently who attends a very large Southern Baptist church in Houston, the pastor got up and said, "I need you to stop emailing me. Trump did not win. You need to let it go." And he had to say these things from the pulpit. "Stop asking me to pray about it. Stop asking me to do this. I'm not going to." And then he said, and this is the crux of it, our hope is not in Donald Trump. Our hope is in Jesus. And I think for every person of faith, that's it.
Yeah.
So For a long time, I've wondered, did the church change or did I change? Did my experiences, because my experiences in my lifestyle greatly changed, did that change me or had the church change? In reading your book, I was able to, or you were able to put into words so much of what I had felt. And so I was able to understand it in a way that I never had before through what you wrote. Have other people expressed this to you? Have other women, kind of had the same realization?
Yes, I have received so many letters. Honestly, the book released a year ago, had a nice little NPR Morning Edition debut, which meant within 2 days, the letters started coming, and they have not let up. If anything, I get more today, any given day, than I did when the book first released. And almost all of them say some version of, this is the story of my life, but I never understood how all these pieces fit together. And so, it's a history of evangelical popular culture. And so I think it connects with the everyday experience of just ordinary evangelicals. Like, there's some theology in here. There are some movers and shakers, and that's definitely part of the story. But it's also, the Christian radio and Christian publishing and what did you read with the girls in your book club kind of thing, and, small groups at church. And so it really does, I think, connect very intimately with people's own experiences. And honestly, the response for many readers is both traumatic and empowering. It's traumatic because they realize exactly what they'd been a part of. And for some, there's enormous pain, particularly for women who suffered abuse, for women who made life choices 20, 30 years ago that they desperately wish they could go back and undo, or for men and women who are acknowledging their own complicity in this. And I've been so impressed with readers who are grappling with not just what happened to them, but what they did to perpetuate this. And they're asking really good questions like, why didn't I see what was happening here? Why was I okay with this? Why was I so comfortable being in these spaces for such a long time when what I was participating in was doing so much harm to so many people? And so I've honestly been really blown away by the reader response to Jesus and John Wayne.
I love that they're reaching out, that they're asking these questions. I would say any growth is good growth. And when you're living through something, it's really hard to see it happening.
Absolutely.
So what role do you think the development of the suburbs played in this rise of the idea of the white nuclear family?
Yeah. Suburbs really do play an important role here. So if you go back to, World War II, really, which is the moment when evangelicals are coming together, forming the National Association of Evangelicals, and that's during the 1940s. And then the war comes to an end. And we're right in the early Cold War era, but we're also in this post-war era where we have the baby boom, and we have the enormous kind of building in the suburbs, and you have the pressure, especially on women, to leave the workforce from the Second World War. A lot of propaganda to reinforce "quote unquote" traditional gender roles, which were not at all traditional. It was kind of a modern conception, and that modern conception was very much a white middle class ideal, which relied on a male breadwinner, which in that historical moment was really bolstered by the federal government, by the GI Bill. And so you have the white male breadwinner and the female homemaker. And for conservative evangelicals, that was very quickly conflated with God's will. And this is very much the vision of gender, of femininity and masculinity that emerged in this moment, and that evangelicals kind of claimed as God ordained. It was only ever accessible to some white middle class Americans. And frankly, a lot of women didn't really like it. And what was interesting to me was some of the texts that I talk about on white evangelical womanhood that were written in the 1960s and 1970s started with the same premise that Betty Friedan did, that American housewives were miserable. Because this was a new way of existing. You're in isolation. You're not appreciated. It's a very lonely experience. You're not fulfilled. And Christian women also felt this way, but their solution was different. Whereas Betty Friedan pointed women towards feminism and equality, Christian women decided, you know what? You just have to accept your role. You have to accept your submissive role. You have to absolutely support your husband through thick and thin, no matter what his behavior is. And that is your key to happiness. And so that was really interesting to me. And so it's to love and serve your husband and to embrace your submissive nature and submissive role. But it is a very historically specific ideal of womanhood.
I'll say. Full disclosure, I have been a homemaker most of our marriage, more by circumstance than design. And I've tried to, according to my husband and daughter, I fill essential roles because they are incapable of filling those roles on their own. But it's not something that I hate or I find is drudgery, but I can definitely identify with those feelings of isolation, even in, the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're ready to jump into some fun rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am.
You wrote an article last month criticizing the movie Braveheart for its macho violence. So what's a movie from the 90s that you do love?
Oh, yeah, that was a lot of fun. Triggered Ted Cruz just a little bit.
Just a little.
Yeah. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here because I have to go 2001 to get to Legally Blonde. And so I'll use that as a great antidote.
I would always say that to Alex when he was at Harvard. It was like, oh, what? Is it hard?
I love it.
Okay, so you recently took a road trip where your daughter wanted to listen to nothing but Taylor Swift. So relatable. Now that you're an expert, a subject matter expert, what is your favorite Taylor Swift song?
This is a really hard question. And so, yes, it's my 8-year-old who's a huge Taylor Swift fan. And in 1989, hands down, favorite album, but then it's almost a toss-up. I'm going to go with Bad Blood. It's my mood right now.
I like Shake It Off.
Shake It Off, that's the other one. It's a toss-up.
So we tried to get in Alex's opening statement for the public hearing a line from a Taylor Swift song, and it just didn't work out. The lawyers took it out.
That is a crying shame.
I know. It was so
Thank
good.
you for your efforts.
Yeah, we tried. If it was up to you to choose the music for the next road trip, what would you listen to?
So my kids never let me listen to U2, and that's so telling. I mean, of course I like U2. I'm a white Christian progressive woman of a certain age, and so U2 it is, and they just make me change the music every time. So one of these road trips I want to listen to U2.
Fair. Bono and Taylor Swift, they go well together. You use a lot of GIFs on Twitter. Do you have a favorite reaction GIF?
I don't have just one. I think that my go-to tend to be anything Kristen Bell, Eleanor Shellstrop, and Buffy. And I think that, my identity is somewhere between the two. And so any of those work for almost any occasion.
Yeah, I agree. I heard your son starred in the school musical last spring. So if you had the opportunity and the ability, what musical theater role would you like to play?
Oh, so we're going to have to allow for a little gender fluidity here. I really want to be Daveed Diggs. So there's that. The other role I would say would be Mandy Patinkin's Che Guevara from the Evita. So it has to be that version, and it has to be Mandy Patinkin. I was obsessed with Mandy Patinkin for probably the first 2 decades of my life.
That's a great obsession. You can't go wrong with that.
And he's still great. I'm still obsessed.
He is. So. I know. He's amazing. Okay. Well, that is it for our rapid fire questions. Thank you so much for joining me today. If people want to find you and your work online, where would they look?
So I have a website, KristinDumez.com, and that's D-U-M-E-Z, like Dumez. And I put a lot of my writings up there. I'm also on Facebook at KK Dumez. I have an author page, but I'm pretty much on Twitter every 30 seconds or so. So that's the best place to follow me, and that's at KK Dumez, KKDUMEZ.
Okay. Well, if people follow both of us, then that's like a full-time job. So, yes. All right. Well, this was such a pleasure. Just amazing. Thank you so much for being here on the Suburban Women Problem.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm a big fan.
Welcome back, everyone. Rachel, I so enjoyed your interview with Kristin. I didn't want it to end. One place of community when it comes to faith that I have found is in books. So I love to find new books like the book Kristin wrote. And it is one place where I have found this sense of connection that has allowed me to change my mind and change my viewpoint and to find other people who have kind of done the same.
100%. I totally agree with that. There might not be people in your community who are taking a chance to be reflective and to really think through these issues. But there is a lot of people in the online space. And, it's Kristin, as I said, her book is just so well researched and so well done. And I think it really adds a lot to this discussion.
Oh, yeah. So when she talked about like the wild at heart, a lot of the little tidbits she picked up were things I grew up with. I grew up with hearing the men talk about this book, Wild at Heart. And it was like she was talking from my community.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So now we would like to have our toast to joy to end on a high note, celebrate those things. Amanda, what is your toast to joy this week?
My toast to joy is to my daughter, Nora, who yesterday learned how to ride her bike for the first time ever.
Yay!
And it was so amazing to watch and to push her off and watch her go and take this leap of faith. So we're talking about faith today. And you could see she had to just take this leap of faith that I can do it. And I heard her whisper to herself, "You're in charge. You're in charge. You're in charge." As she went off pedaling down, on her bike. And it was actually on our neighbor's driveway. They have this very long, flat driveway. And so she had 3 different families, all of our neighborhood out there cheering her on, like, "You can do it, you can do it." And it is this memory that I know is etched in my brain and will be etched in her brain of just this supportive community who love her and are so proud of everything she does.
Oh, I love that.
So Katie, what's your toast to joy?
Well, speaking of kids just being fun and amazing and just fun overall, yesterday I went with my 6-year-old son and some other family to a family friend's house, and they have like a working farm, and they had a skid steer out. Now, I only know that it is a skid steer, and I just would have called this a tractor, but I have 2 young sons, so that means I live with vehicle experts. So I know that this was in fact a skid steer. Anyway, this family friend says, "You want to try to drive it?" And I said yes. And I hopped on the skid steer and he taught me to drive it. And then my 6-year-old said, "Can I get on and do it too?" So he's up there doing the controls. We are picking up, huge amounts of dirt and moving them over to another part of the property and putting dirt there. And my 6-year-old and we can't stop talking about it. We will not stop talking about it. We are returning to that farm. So what about you, Rachel? What's your toast to joy this week?
My toast to joy is my daughter returning from camp. We picked her up on Friday. She had an amazing time, and it's just great to have her home and be together again. But I'm so proud of her for trying all kinds of new things and making new friends and everything she did. Her sitting and listening to her for hours, show us pictures and tell us all the stories. And I still think her highlight was when her friend Jessica put her swimsuit bottoms on her head. I don't really see how that was so funny. I guess it was definitely a you had to be there moment, but the joy on her face and in her voice when she tells that story, it's contagious, even if I don't quite get it. It's great. I'm also just really thankful that we, again, are returning to normal and things can be, we can have these experiences again.
There are camp people in the world and not camp people in the world. And I'm very happy to hear that your daughter is with me in being a camp person.
She would just do activities all day long, every day. So it really fits her personality. It kind of sounds exhausting to me, but, I think she would use a full-time cruise director if we had one employed at our house, just to go from one thing to the other. So it definitely worked for her. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And Katie, thank you for pinch hitting for Jasmine. It was great to have you. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please write a review and rate it. And we hope to see you again next week on another episode of The Suburban Women Problem.
The Suburban Women Problem was created by Red Wine and Blue. Our executive producer is Beverly Batt. Our producer and editor is Amy Thorstensen, and our video producer is Ashley Hufford. If you're ready to be part of the Suburban Women Problem, head over to redwine.blue and sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss a thing.